Hey everybody, we are back with our children's director, Mark Burrows. So glad to have you back again with us. Um, let's talk about all these crazy roles you've had. You've been here how many years? You said 95?
I started in 95, so I have in August I'll start year 30.
Holy cow. Are we
Yeah.
going to have a 30th anniversary party
Oh,
for
I
you?
hope not.
I think we should. So I want to go through some of these hats that you've worn.
Sure.
You've been the choir director, the
Yes.
youth choir director, the children's choir director,
Mm-hmm.
children's minister.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that you're a talented auctioneer at the day school auction in
I've
the
been an
past.
auctioneer, talented. I'm the slowest auctioneer on the planet, which, yeah, you know they had that pattern, and I'm like, okay, 500. How about 550? And
Yeah, that's pretty good.
yeah, yeah. So I have done it.
That's some
They
talent.
they now bring in professionals, and they've made a lot more money since. So yeah,
Oh, I'm sure they made plenty of money with you as
they did all right.
the slow auctioneer.
They did all right.
Well, one of the first things, and we were talking earlier about how kind of you've blended some of these roles from you coming on as youth choir director, and then that kind of shifted into, okay, now I'll do the children's moment at
Mm-hmm.
11 o'clock. And so then that's kind of your first jumping into working with kids even. And then let's talk about Children First.
Okay.
Children First was, well, actually, why don't you tell us when this started and kind of how it evolved
Yeah.
and what it did for
Yeah.
the church?
Right. So had just started doing the children's message. You know, at our church, we didn't even have a children's moment until '06.
Mm.
And so in '07, I'd gone up to Dr. B and I said, "Hey, can I give it a try?" And he's like, "Sure." And so I did one in September of '07 and ended up doing it. And so we were out at a staff retreat in Glen Rose, and I had been talking about worship. I was still the music director at the time. We were looking at ways that we could have 9:30 and 11 kind of have their own distinct identities. And after we'd been talking, I was walking down the hall, and Phyllis Barron comes up and says, "Have you ever considered family worship?" And it's like everything else that we'd been talking about that whole morning just kind of went out of my head. And I kind of became obsessed with it. It was a wonderful seed. So all of the stuff that we had through Children First, that started with the seed that Phyllis had planted. And so just mold it and visited with Cynthia about it a lot. And what could it be, and what could family worship look like? And so we talked about it with the Children's Council and other people. And anytime you start talking about worship and change,
Oh, change.
right, yeah, people's radar. And because when you think about change, often we go in a place, well, what am I going to lose that I
Mhm.
like? Because change typically means some form of trade-off. So after a lot of concern and planning and excitement and worry and all the different human emotions that go with that, in August of '08, we did a service in the sanctuary, and we called it Together. And we did it both at 9:30 and 11. It had some traditional elements, like it had a sermon, a brief sermon, about 12-minute sermon, but a sermon nonetheless. Had puppets, had music, both traditional music and some more slightly more contemporary. Had traditional hymns, and so we had a survey, and we got quite a response back in terms of the percentage of attendees who filled out the survey. And what we did not have was any kind of mandate, like we must start doing this new kind of service called Together next week. But there also wasn't this, absolutely not, this was horrible. I mean, there were individuals who said, absolutely not, this was horrible, let's never do this again. And there were some who said, yes, let's start this as soon as possible. But most of it was more, yeah, there's something here. I don't know if every week is what we want, but there's something here. And so we took that and we looked at it and thought, well, what if we do something once a month, and we don't do it in the sanctuary, so we're not upsetting that pre-existing flow. And rather than call it Together, because we weren't really going to be together, it was truly going to be children. Why don't we just call it what it is, Children First, where we're really prioritizing the worship needs of children first. where it's just going to be wigglier. And because, those of us who work with children know that being good does not mean being still and being quiet. Those aren't the same thing. Worshipful doesn't mean this necessarily. And so it's a priority. Children first. It's going to be at the location, First United Methodist Church, and we'll do it the first Sunday of every month. And so we did that. We made tweaks to what we had done in the sanctuary, and we started that in November of '08. And it was mostly children, some of the teachers and other caregivers down in the children's wing, and me and a few other people, maybe a few parents. If the child had a leadership role in that service, their parents would be there. And I thought, gosh, this is really neat what we're doing. And it had a creed, and it had a doxology and a Gloria Patri, and we did the Lord's Prayer every week, and we did a traditional hymn. And because what I wanted is for the kids, once they were old enough to go sit in the sanctuary with their family, to not have it feel so foreign.
Right.
Oh, I know this prayer from Children First. I know this hymn. I've sung this before with Mr. Mark. And so I thought, I think there's a togetherness aspect that's important. So there were 3 primary adult Sunday schools at that time that had children who were of that age. And I went to each one of those classes and said, hey, what if just once a month, instead of Sunday school, you came to this Children First worship and sat with your kids, and you could all hear the Bible story together. You could all kind of hear what I was saying together. And they all said yes. So all 3 of those Sunday school classes said yes. Those services were at 9:45 till 10:30. And there were some practical reasons for that. There was a disciple church that was in there before that was 8:30 to 9:30. And so we couldn't even get in there till 9:30. So, and it took us that long just to set up everything.
Right.
We had all kinds of banners and offertory bowls, and we had to set up the microphone and at the kids' height so they could practice if they were leading the creed or whatever. And then we had to end at 10:30 sharp, if not a minute early, because back then there was a little communion service that would happen at 10:30 in the chapel. And so it grew a little bit to where we had maybe 100 to 120, which is
in that chapel. Yeah,
that feels really full.
For sure.
But and if it never grew beyond that, we were just fine. That we would have and then we would continue to tweak. One of the things that we added was something called Our Part in the Story, where someone like Rusty Looney or Jennifer Bond, or we've had others, Trevor Shive has done it, where and now we have Amber Shive doing it, where we talk about what our theme is for that service, what the Bible story is, and then how something that's going on in the life of a child relates back to that, and they would be interviewed, and we'd have 3 kids be interviewed. We'd always have the puppets to kind of tell their version of it. Wendell and Lorraine were huge hits. And then one thing, I would do a children's message, which was kind of served in the placeholder for the sermon.
Yeah, okay.
So there was one Sunday where we were going a little bit long, and I'm seeing people look through that little window into the chapel like it's time for the communion service soon. Yeah, exactly. Look at you, and giving me a little bit of stink eye. And so I'm like, okay, well, the kids are singing the benediction. I can't cut that. Okay, this child's going to do that. I can't cut that. The only thing we can cut is the thing that I was going to do. And when you cut something that people care about deeply, because you're going to get emails. Not one email from cutting the part with me speak. So lesson learned. So that was something we cut. We're not going to do that anymore. So less talking for me. Everybody wins. And so that service was going along pretty well. Well, we would do the Children First, even if it was the first Sunday in July, which would coincide with the 4th of July weekend. We knew we were going to have a small crowd, but okay. We wanted to be true to that because we wanted to keep that rhythm going. Well, it happened that we found that we had come up against where there was going to be a year where the first Sunday in April was Easter. Well, Mark, you're not going to want to do Children First. No one's going to come to Children First. They're going to be in the sanctuary. I'm like, you watch me. And so we stacked the deck. And this is where this part came in. So we decided after this service, after this Children First Easter service in the chapel, let's have a live butterfly release. And so this was the first year we ordered live, but we do this every year now at the Easter egg hunt, but it started here. And so we after the service, and it just captures people's imagination,
Sure.
right?
Yeah,
Easter
butterflies.
and in April in Texas is just the best. And so we had 250 people at that service. We had to
In the
bring
chapel?
in the chapel.
Holy cow.
Most of them were in the chapel. We had to open the back door so there are people standing out in the hall. We had kids sitting all along the kneelers. We had to bring in, I don't know how many extra chairs. And keep in mind, we got some tiny heinies, so you can squeeze a
Sure.
a
Okay.
lot of
Yeah,
people
that's
in there.
true.
And so I was able to go to our staff meeting and say, we had 250 people at that service. We're starting to outgrow the chapel,
Mhm.
so it's time for us to look to the next space. And so the next obvious space was Wesley Hall. Well, so you asked a very short question. You're
No,
getting a very
this is what we want. This
all
is
right,
church chat.
yeah. And so the twosome class had been in Wesley Hall for years. That was their Sunday school class. The twosome class, it was one of the bedrocks of our church. I mean, there were members of that class who remembered the historic walkover in the early 30s, going from
Oh,
the old
wow.
location
Yeah.
to there. It was, I mean, they were so many of the pillars of our church. Now, this was, 2010, around that time, and the class was smaller, that room was big, and so there was a recognition that maybe something could happen in Wesley Hall. But they all looked at me like, well, how are you going to break it to them that they're going to be kicked out? I'm like, well, why do we have to kick them out? And so I asked the president of the Sunday school class at that time, is it okay if I come talk to the twosome class about an idea? And he said, and he knew why, and we had talked. And so I went to the twosome class and I said, hey, this family service that we started has grown. And if it had stayed in the chapel, it would be just fine. But it's grown to where it's bigger than what the chapel can hold. And they're like, we've heard, and that's good. And they're visionary. I mean, people that were part of an initial walkover understand vision, right?
Absolutely.
They understand
Yeah.
what it means to grow
Mhm.
and to evolve and to become. And but there was still, I mean, it's human nature, some kind of sadness at the thought that. And I said, first of all, well, why don't would you consider being a part of our community too? Because a lot of our kids, their grandparents live far away, and they could do to have a church grandparent. And they're like, okay, maybe. And then
And this is still for just one Sunday.
one Sunday a
One
month.
Sunday a
And then
month.
their Sunday school class the other Sundays, but one Sunday a
Okay,
month.
yeah.
And they're like, maybe. And I said, wouldn't it be nice if, in the fall in October, if our families start in the chapel, we can say goodbye to the chapel and thank the chapel for all it's meant for starting it. And then we have a historic walkover from the chapel to Wesley Hall. And everybody's like, this is a good idea. And
Another good idea.
And so they were on board and they loved it. And so we did. It was October, I believe, of 2010. And we all met. We said goodbye to the chapel. We said thank you to the chapel. And they all walked out and headed to Wesley Hall. And I'm always the last person. I'm the caboose so that we never lose a child. Turn the lights out. And I walk in, I'm the last person. And the twosome class was standing up, giving our families a standing ovation. Just one of the great moments.
Awesome.
It was just that feeling of acceptance and affirmation, and that they were saying, this may be a little disruptive to us, but it's okay. And so for several months, we worshiped together. And then when it came to do our part in the story, we would sometimes have two children, and then we'd have someone from the twosome community. And our first Sunday, we were talking about change and the Abraham and Sarah story and how they had to change where they lived and change their names and we'd changing locations and all the change that meant. And so we had the three different stories. And one was a little girl who had changed schools and she was a little nervous and what to eat. And the older adult Well, he was a World War II pilot, and he talked about how a change in flight plan saved his life and the lives of other people with him, and how rich that experience was because the generations were together. And so that was really that's what I'd wanted all along, is not the kind of Facebookification of worship experiences where everybody gets exactly the worship experience, that it fits every song is exactly what they want, the lighting is exactly what they want, the words are exactly what they want, but we all give a little bit, and we all do it together. It's like a potluck. I'm not going to eat everything that's on the potluck. There's another thing for potluck, but it's like, I'm not going to eat everything that's on that spread. There's some things I'm going to look at and go, I don't want that to touch my plate, but someone's going to want it,
Right.
and I'm glad it's there, and I'm glad that person that wants it, it's there. And here, you seem to be really eyeing this. Let me hand this to you. Now, will you hand me those roasted Brussels sprouts? Because I would love to fill my plate with those. And that's always been my goal with the together. So then Children First eventually outgrew Wesley Hall. We started to involve the youth choir with it, and they would sing, and the younger ones really loved the youth choir and seeing them there. And adding that part of the community, it exploded. And so then we had to move to the sanctuary, and that's where we stayed for years. Yeah.
Well, it seems like this is what church should be, right?
Oh, I hope so. I think so.
Just this multi-generational, we're all together. And I love what you said about just, not everybody's going to get the exact same thing. And it's not everybody needs the exact same thing as they worship. Do you feel like that changed our church? Because, and by that, I go back to when I was in high school. We'd do youth ministry, Sunday school, and everything over in the Justin, and then we would always walk over and we would sit in the balcony, the top left transept. Is that what transept? Is that what
I don't know.
Whatever, up in the left corner, and we'd sit over there. And I just remember I was in high school, so I like to wear jeans. I still wear jeans to church. I like to wear jeans. I had some friends who would wear shorts and hats and things like that. And I feel like when I was in high school, this has been early 2000s, there was it was a high church where you got to wear your suit, you got to have your tie on, you've got, look at that. Wah, wah. You got to have your suit, your tie on, your blazer, whatever that is. Sure. And if you don't, you're going to get some weird looks.
Sure.
If you got walking a baby and they start crying, somebody's going to look over at you and go, take that baby out of here. I feel like that was kind of it was almost like an unsaid rule, or at least to me, it felt unsaid, that you have to act a certain way in the sanctuary. Do you feel like Children First started to move the ship in a different this ship in a different direction from that?
Yeah, it's a good question. To your point about whether it was unsaid, when I first started here, it was a said.
Oh.
Like people would, if a fan, and there are members here who will still remember a time when ushers and other volunteers would see an infant child and say, we have a nursery for that, and and that has been a really that's been a real challenge. I love high church, not the trappings of high church where it's just you wear the suit, but like the liturgical, where we standing for the gospel, tasting and seeing the experiential aspects of it, I think are really beautiful. And I think kids can think that too, depending on how we're raising them. But yeah, it was a big challenge. I think it just took a lot of time. Some gentle time. I mean, again, I've been doing the children's message since 2007, so that's been 17 years, and it's been a very gradual progression to that. Yeah, when we did, in fact, it even had enough of an effect that when we did that sample service in 2008 to kind of put our feelers out, and we got the responses back, already the 2008 the 11 o'clock folks were a little bit more primed for play because that was the 9:30 didn't have a children's message, just the 11. So they were a little bit more open to it because they were already more primed for play. You fast forward that to now, and it's the sense of play that the whole congregation has. And the 11 o'clock is considered our more traditional service. But though, first of all, the kids come down, and I've mentioned this on Sunday, we used to kind of sit over to one side on the steps. Man, they have chosen to sit smack dab in the middle of the sanctuary. They sit right there in front of the altar, and it's beautiful. Like they've nudged me over there because they belong there and they know it, and it's great. It's more conversational. Like it's a lot. I prep a lot for these, but acknowledging that what I have prepared to say and what the kids are going to say.
There's some good moments.
Yeah, I've just had to kind of let that go. And sometimes they're just going to take over the conversation, and that's just fine. We had a kid that was practically doing yoga on Sunday, and I was talking, and all of a sudden people were laughing. I'm like, that wasn't funny. I said something funny, and then I look up and I'm like, okay. And then I had to go assure the mom, I'm like, she's fine.
Yeah.
Like I can tell you stories of Grace Burrows when she was 4. She's fine, and she's exactly where she's supposed to be, behaving exactly the way she's supposed to behave because she's 4.
Right.
And that our congregation doesn't look at that with horror, but with joy is just amazing. And the number of times where all say, congregation, can we all do this together? Just kind of a little editorializing. Sometimes I think it's a little cruel that we have worship, and now we're going to take you 20 people. You come up to the front and sit still and be real quiet, and we're all going to look at you while we have more worship. And I'm like, which 20 adults would voluntarily do that? The kids in the choir, right? And a few other people. But so I'll often involve the whole congregation so that kids don't feel so on display, so they don't feel like they're having to perform. They're not really there to bring joy. They're not there to make us feel better about the future. They're there because they're God's children. And they have every right to be there and hear those words and to be a part of those prayers and those experiences. And so I'll have the whole congregation do an all play so that we can just all do it together. And the congregation they dive right in. They know the songs, they clap along, they play. And I mean, Casey Orr with the Healthy Plate Discipleship. I mean, play is one of our 6 ingredients. It's not a condiment. It's a main part of the Healthy Plate. And it's been beautiful to see. I mean, it's one thing to put it on a logo, the Church for Children, but the amount of welcome and joy and acceptance and that our congregation has for kids now is it's beautiful. It's amazing. Yeah.
Well, and talk about joy. A couple weeks ago, we celebrated Vacation Bible School here.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And the other day you talked in staff meeting about your shifting focus and understanding of what the Spirit stick means to VBS and how you used to view it and how maybe this year changed it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it kind of in the change can be good category. So when I started working with Vacation Bible School, it was years before I was children's minister. I would help Cynthia. Sometimes I would lead music. Other times I would lead the little assembly, which used to happen in what's called the children's atrium, which is now where the indoor play space is. And then I started helping Cynthia with big assembly in Wesley Hall. And it was chaos. I mean, which is fun, right? Yeah. It's like you don't go to a Springsteen concert, everybody screaming and going, no, this is just too chaotic and loud. You're like, you love it because that energy. Right. And the most chaotic part of the most chaotic 30 minutes was the Spirit Stick, where you have all the grades, kindergarten first all the way up through 6th grade, can do some kind of chant, and then they just scream real loud. They would throw crepe paper and shoot those little things that would pop, and there were air horns, and they were screaming, and to win the spirit stick, and then the next day someone else would win the spirit, and it was just this just competition for competition's sake. And you know, I learned real early on that if you don't give the spirit stick to kindergarten or first grade within the first 2 days, there's going to be tears, because their whole worth that morning is wrapped up in whether they won the spirit stick, and they're just pleading with their eyes, please, we're trying so hard. And so I did not like the spirit stick, and we talked about getting rid of it. Like, this is just a mess. So we started making tweaks. I'm not a big, let's make wholesale changes all at once. What I've learned through the years is that let's make some little tweaks and see what's worth keeping, and see if we can get this where we need it to be. And so we added a spirit prayer where we actually invoked the presence of the Holy Spirit to the spirit stick. Otherwise, it's just a stick. And then that worked a little bit. And then we started incorporating the Bible verse for the week as the beginning of the chant. And then each grade level would have 10 seconds to do whatever they wanted to do. I always say, you know, no fireworks, no live animals, no dead animals. And then after 10 seconds, they have to sit down. Wherever they are, you got to sit down. And that worked pretty well. Then I started saying, well, what if we look at spirit? And I would encourage the kids, not just as how loud we can be, but about listening to each other and being being supportive and making space. And a lot of the Holy Spirit's about making space. And a little bit. This year it really took. And I would make that little spiel the first couple of days, and somewhere around midweek, I saw a sign. Some kid in 5th grade had done a sign saying kindergarten rocks. And I pointed out, I'm like, isn't it like someone making a sign for another grade? And then the next day there was a sign from a 4th grader about go 1st grade. And then the 5th graders were doing sign language applause for the 2nd grade. And it was, people were rooting for each other. And it wasn't about winning the spirit stick. It was about having spirit. And this culminated on Friday. We always give the spirit stick on the final day to our Super Sixers, because we do a special blessing of the Super Sixers.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
It's rigged.
And it happens. It does. And the Sixers know this. And where they get the spirit stick on the last day, because it's their last assembly as children. Because the following year, they're going to be youth volunteers. And so we want to do something special to send them on their way, to tell them how much we love you. And so I hadn't even done the spiel about the blessing yet. I said, let's invite our Super Sixers down to the front. They were up in the balcony of the sanctuary.
They're always in the balcony.
Always in the balcony of the sanctuary for assembly. And so then a chant started going, let's go 6th grade, let's go, and it started, it's small, and it started to grow and to grow, and they haven't even made their way down. So about 45 seconds later, they're down there, they're all lined up in the front, and the chant just kept going and going. And I think it almost 2 minutes of nothing but just all the other grades chanting for them. So we did the blessing, and then after the blessing, they chanted for another minute. And it just, if I didn't wrap it up, I think they would have still been in there chanting. It was just, the spirit stick went from being this chaotic yelling, gotta win it, to we're gonna support each other. And it truly became the spirit stick. And it's just, it was awesome.
And it's all takes place in that sanctuary that used to, kids may not have felt like they belonged.
And they run the place now. It's great.
That's fantastic. Well, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be back with Mark. We're going to talk about a new job opportunity, as well as composing and arrangements and his work in that realm. So we'll be right back.